Reading 10 from the Psychological Commentaries on the Teaching of Gurdjieff and Ouspensky by Dr. Maurice Nicoll, Volume 2, Berlin, March 11, 1944. The Enneagram 6. We will continue to speak about the shock given at point 6 in the Enneagram. I will remind you briefly that this is the first conscious shock, called in general the shock of self-remembering, and that it does not take place mechanically in man. I repeat these matters because it is so important for people to grasp them. The whole idea of esoteric psychology and its great distinction from Western psychology lies in the fact that it does not regard a man as being conscious. Esoteric psychology regards man as being in a state of sleep in which everything happens to him, a state in which he imagines that he is conscious, a state in which he imagines he has will, in which he imagines he has a permanent ego, and in which he imagines he can do. Esoteric psychology teaches us that all this is illusion, and that man attributes to himself what he does not possess. The first stage of his beginning to possess such attributes belongs to this shock at point 6 that we talk about from different angles. Some people think that a shock means only a sudden unpleasant experience. Certainly some shocks are of this kind and are often useful, but a far larger conception of the shock at point 6 is necessary. It is here that a whole change of outlook, a whole change of mind comes in. We have really to understand what it means that things are not as they seem. We have really to understand that we and others are asleep and that we cannot do, and that we have no real will, nor any permanent ego, and so on. The realization of all this is a shock, both a slow one and at times a sudden one. You have heard in an earlier stage of the teaching one definition of self-remembering as the realization of our mechanicalness. When we begin to realize that it is not we who do, but it that does, then we have a taste of a certain kind of self-remembering. But you will understand that if you cannot in any way separate yourselves from yourselves, you will never grasp what it means to realize one's mechanicalness. You will call everything I, and this is just one of the greatest sins that we can commit against ourselves and against others. We are really legion, and we take ourselves as one, and we behave towards other people as if each of them were one. When you observe yourself uncritically and sincerely over some period of time, you will begin to notice how much you are mechanical. You will begin to notice that you can scarcely say, "It is I who do this," but it is it which does this. And you will notice that you consent to it, and as it were, call it I, although this is not a conscious process, but a kind of self-justifying that goes on in the background and makes everything seem to be all right, so that you believe that everything going on is I. For example, there is inner talking going on in you, and you go along with it just as if it were you doing it. And really, these I's which are talking and saying things to you are doing it all in your name, or rather you are believing that they are you. Then quite suddenly, a more conscious I, a work I, may say to you, "Why aren't you in the work?" And then everything changes completely. The talking stops completely, and the eyes that were doing it all run away and hide themselves. Now, you cannot give yourselves the shock at point 6 if you always go your own way, or always try to go your own way. Always to go your own way is to remain asleep, to remain mechanical, to remain a machine. When you have your own way, when things go smoothly, you are not going against yourself, and you are not conscious. When two things cross, we get a slight moment of consciousness. We wake up a little for a moment. If you never put the work in opposition to life, you will have no cross, in a big sense, because the work and life go in different directions, and this cross is not comparable with the little crosses that life produces, that come and go and that we deal with in our own life way. But it is a quite different kind of cross. Once it begins to be formed in you, it remains and is felt all the time. You know that you cannot have your own way, sometimes more distinctly and sometimes less distinctly, but you know it all the time, and you know that if things seem easier, you cannot delude yourself into imagining that this is what you want. The reality of the work becomes a greater reality than the realities of life. When things are easier in life, when one begins to make friends with life for a time, it does not shut out the presence of the work behind one. Life can give us ease, and the work can give us ease, but they are different in taste. All this refers to what I spoke about in connection with the first conscious shock, to the effect that we have to know the difference between being asleep and being awake by inner taste before we even begin to know how to give this shock. You understand that if you are identified with life, you are in life. You respond only to A influences. You are in all the feelings that life gives. You are in all its anxieties. Then you will be far away from the work. The work will seem like a dream. You will be far away from any giving to yourself of the shock at point 6. You all understand that you must reinterpret life and see it in the light of the work. But as long as you are completely in life eyes and completely absorbed in the cares, anxieties, frictions, and ambitions of life, how can you expect to interpret life differently? Only work eyes can do this. Life eyes know only one language, that of life, but work eyes know 2 languages, that of life and that of the work. Were not this the case, what hope would there be for us save to serve the machinery of organic life? How could we separate ourselves from ourselves if there were nothing in us that was different from ourselves? How, if you think you are one, can you separate yourself from yourself? Here there comes in another aspect of the shock at point 6. It consists in always trying to give the chief valuation to work eyes at difficult periods. Try to obey what the work says in any particular situation. Think out how it would be to act in a work way and try to obey what you perceive and visualize yourself doing. Of course, you will have to remember about the work and what it teaches to do this. This is why it is so important to get to know about this work, really to study it, really to make an effort to understand its teaching, to keep it alive in one's mind, to see new connections. Now, I wish to return to the early definition of self-remembering as the realization of one's own mechanicalness. When we find ourselves talking in some typical way, we realize that we are talking from some attitude connected with which are 1 or 2 gramophone records. You know that it is not so difficult to see gramophone records in other people once the idea of them has been pointed out to you. It is much more difficult to see gramophone records in yourself and to catch them working. You can recognize them later on by a certain taste and also by an inner feeling of loss of force. Whenever we think mechanically or feel mechanically, we tend to lose force. When you become aware of some typical gramophone records, both of the kind that you express in outwardly spoken words and the kind that run inside you internally, you begin to understand something of what mechanicalness is in yourself. Of course, you will not if you justify, if you find some reasons that are sufficient for you to account for speaking outwardly or inwardly as you are speaking. Whenever you find yourself saying things again and again, this is mechanical. When you become aware of mechanicalness of this kind, the illusion of yourself begins to be destroyed. a very interesting struggle takes place, which I will not attempt to describe, as it is an experience that everyone must go through, and which everyone will inevitably meet at a certain stage if he works on himself. Now, this illusion of oneself must be broken into before the shock at point 6 can really be given. If you try to give this shock when you are filled with the illusion of yourself that you have always had, you will not be able to become more conscious, but on the contrary, you will tend to go more asleep. We have to realize our position. You remember the story of the rope and the precipice. A man is quite unaware of either. Then he sees the precipice, and then he realizes his true position, and then he sees the rope above his head. Do you understand what this means? A man does not want the rope until he sees the danger, and does not see the danger as long as he is in the illusion that everything is all right. In the same way, a person in the illusion of himself or herself, a person in something not as yet broken open, will make no right effort of self-remembering, because since the precipice is not seen, the rope is not seen. Now, the rope is the work. The rope is esotericism that lies just above us, but at a higher level. The healing influences of esotericism can reach us in the third state of consciousness, but not in the second state. The first conscious shock is to raise us to that consciousness, the forms of awareness, that kind of light that belong to the third state. Now you will understand why it is said that the realization of one's mechanicalness is a form of self-remembering. It means that we begin to become aware of the danger we are in, because what we have taken for granted in ourselves we begin to see as illusion, and we begin to see that we do not exist. And once this illusion of yourself begins to be broken, it begins to be possible to feel the influences of the work, not only reaching, but teaching you. If, however, you are convinced that the present pattern of yourself is right, it is naturally difficult to work on yourself because there is no private reason why you should. If you feel no lack, how can you work? If you feel that you have lost nothing, how can you seek? If you feel you know already, how can you be taught? If you fundamentally are satisfied with yourself, how can you change yourself?